The grand auction hall throbbed with life, a kaleidoscope of flashing lights bouncing off the perfectly polished floors, all in service of illuminating the sand-covered arena. I, Hank, an old rancher whose hands bear the map of time, sat quietly at the back. My faded plaid shirt and worn cowboy hat were a stark contrast to the sea of tailored suits and designer dresses around me. I was an observer, a ghost from a different era, watching a spectacle that felt foreign and yet familiar. Horses of impeccable lineage, their bloodlines echoing through generations of champions, paraded one by one. Each step they took resonated with the weight of expectation, with the hopes and dreams of their owners. Bids soared, figures ballooning into the hundreds of thousands, a testament to the perceived value of these magnificent creatures. The buyers, the elite of the equestrian world, were a study in calculated precision. They analyzed each muscle, each movement, their eyes like lasers dissecting the animal's potential. To them, this wasn't just a display of beauty and strength, it was an investment, a strategic maneuver in the high-stakes game of horse racing and breeding. The auctioneer's gavel, a symbol of authority and finality, struck the polished wooden podium with a resounding crack. Each strike sealed a deal, a transaction worth fortunes, fortunes that could change lives and shape legacies. Then, a new horse entered the arena and the air shifted, a chestnut stallion. A magnificent specimen of equine perfection, his muscular frame gleaming under the bright lights. He moved with a fluid grace, his hooves barely disturbing the sand as he glided into the center of the arena. But something was off. As soon as the stallion came to a halt, an uneasy tension filled the air. The excited murmurs of the crowd, which had been a constant hum throughout the evening, began to fade. Eyes that had eagerly appraised the previous horses now seemed to avert their gaze, as if afraid of what they might see. The stallion took a deep breath, his flared nostrils hinting at an underlying nervousness. His dark, deep eyes held something that few seemed to notice: sadness, a profound and haunting sorrow that spoke of a past filled with hardship and pain. The auctioneer, a seasoned professional who could usually command a room with his voice alone, cleared his throat, trying to break the increasingly uncomfortable silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing through the hall, "here we have a purebred horse of exceptional lineage, a true champion in the making. Who will place the first bid?" His words hung in the air, unanswered, unacknowledged. The auctioneer glanced around, his eyes searching for any sign of interest, any flicker of recognition, but there was nothing. People whispered among themselves, their voices hushed and secretive, some shaking their heads with an air of knowing disapproval. A young rancher leaned toward the man beside him and muttered something, and both chuckled quietly, their laughter a jarring note in the tense atmosphere. The stallion flicked his ears restlessly, his eyes scanning the crowd as if he understood he was being rejected. He seemed to shrink in on himself, his once proud posture faltering under the weight of the collective disinterest. Seconds stretched into an eternity, and the silence in the arena grew heavier, more oppressive. The auctioneer tried again, his voice strained. "Come on, folks, who will make the first bid for this fine animal? A steal, I tell you." His voice remained steady, but there was a hint of desperation, a subtle undercurrent of unease that betrayed his carefully constructed facade. Then, a firm, aged voice cut through the silence, a voice that had weathered storms and seen its share of hardship. "I'll take him." A wave of murmurs swept through the audience, a collective gasp of surprise and curiosity. All heads turned to see who had dared to break the unspoken consensus, to defy the silent judgment of the crowd. It was an old man sitting at the back of the stands, a relic from a bygone era. He wore a worn-out cowboy hat that had seen better days and a faded plaid shirt that spoke of countless hours spent under the scorching sun. His weathered face, etched with lines that told stories of years spent battling the elements, held a serious expression. His gaze remained locked on the horse, unwavering and resolute. His name was Hank, and he wasn't there to impress anyone, to play the games of the wealthy elite. He was there for a reason he couldn't quite articulate but felt deep in his bones. The auctioneer hesitated for a moment, clearly surprised by the unexpected bid, but professionalism prevailed and he quickly regained his composure. "Sold," he announced, bringing the gavel down with a decisive thud. "Sold to the gentleman in the white hat." Hank slowly stood up, his joints creaking in protest, and walked toward the arena to claim the horse. As he approached, he felt a tightness in his chest, a sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. Something about this animal unsettled him. stirred up memories long buried, emotions he thought he had left behind. An eerie sensation crept over him, a feeling that he was stepping into a story far bigger than himself. He took the reins with steady hands, his touch gentle but firm. The horse didn't pull away, didn't resist. He simply stared at Hank for a long, silent moment, his dark eyes seeming to penetrate his very soul. As Hank led the stallion out of the auction hall into the cool night air, he had no idea he was about to uncover a truth that would change his life forever. A truth that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the past and the enduring power of connection. The night air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth as Hank led the chestnut stallion toward his old pickup truck. The auction grounds had emptied out quickly, the wealthy buyers eager to transport their newly acquired horses to their luxurious stables. Sleek, high-end trailers, pulled by gleaming SUVs, lined the parking lot, a testament to the affluence of the equestrian world. But Hank's setup was different, a stark reminder of a simpler, more rugged way of life. His trailer was old but sturdy, worn down by years of hard work and countless miles on dusty roads. It was a reliable companion, a symbol of his independence and self-sufficiency. The stallion hesitated for a moment before stepping up into the trailer, his deep brown eyes scanning Hank as if trying to recognize him, to decipher the mystery of their connection. Hank spoke to him in a soothing voice, his words gentle and reassuring. "Easy now, boy," he murmured. "We'll get you settled in." As Hank drove down the dark country road, the rhythmic sound of hooves shifting inside the trailer filled the silence. He couldn't shake the strange feeling in his chest, the nagging sense that something about this horse gnawed at him, like a memory just out of reach. His hands tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather. It had been years since he'd been around horses like this, since he'd immersed himself in the world of training and competition. He had walked away from it all, seeking solace in a quieter, simpler life. Maybe that was why he felt so uneasy, so out of sorts. Maybe he just wasn't used to it anymore. When he arrived at his small ranch, Hank parked the truck near the stable and climbed out, stretching his aching muscles. He opened the trailer door, expecting some resistance, some sign of apprehension from the horse. But the stallion stepped down effortlessly, his ears twitching as he took in his new surroundings. He seemed calm, almost accepting, as if he had been expecting this all along. Hank guided him toward an empty stall, talking in a low, soothing voice. "Easy now, boy," he repeated. "We'll get you settled in." But as he led the horse inside, the stallion suddenly stopped, his muscles tensing. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing heavily, his nostrils flaring as he took in the unfamiliar scents and sounds. Then, something unexpected happened, something that sent a shiver down Hank's spine. The horse let out a deep, low nicker, not a sound of distress, but of recognition. His large eyes softened, losing their haunted look, and he stepped forward, pressing his muzzle gently against Hank's shoulder. The old man froze, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't just an affectionate gesture. It felt familiar, intimate, as if the horse knew him, as if they shared a history that transcended the present moment. Hank's breath caught in his throat, his mind struggling to process the overwhelming rush of emotions. He had handled hundreds of horses in his lifetime, but something about this one, this particular connection, sent a shiver down his spine, a feeling he couldn't ignore. That night, long after he had settled the stallion into his new home, Hank sat on his porch, staring out at the barn. The moon cast long, eerie shadows across the yard, and the silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. His mind raced with questions, each one more perplexing than the last. Why had no one at the auction wanted this horse? Why did he feel such an inexplicable connection to him? And why, deep down, did he feel as if he already knew the answer but just couldn't grasp it yet, as if the truth was hidden just beyond the reach of his conscious mind? As the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of hay and horses, Hank let out a slow breath. He would find out, he vowed to himself. He would uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Something told him this was only the beginning, that he had stumbled onto a story far bigger than himself, a story that would challenge his beliefs and force him to confront the ghosts of his past. The morning sun painted the sky in shades of gold and amber as Hank stepped out onto his porch, stretching his aching joints. The night's restless sleep had done little to quiet his thoughts, to quell the turmoil raging within him. There was something about that horse, something that gnawed at him in a way he couldn't explain, a feeling that resonated deep within his soul. He shook his head, pushing the feeling aside, and made his way to the barn. The stallion stood calmly in his stall, ears perked at the sound of Hank's boots crunching against the hay-covered floor. There was a look in the horse's eyes, deep and knowing, almost as if he had been waiting for this moment, anticipating the next step in their shared journey. Grabbing a brush, Hank stepped into the stall and began running the bristles down the horse's glossy coat. "Let's clean you up, boy," he murmured, his voice steady but his mind unsettled. "See what we're working with." The stallion didn't shy away, didn't flinch or resist. In fact, he leaned into the touch, his muscles relaxing under Hank's firm strokes. It was almost as if the routine was familiar to him, as if he had been groomed and cared for countless times before. Hank worked carefully, his hands moving with the ease of a man who had spent a lifetime around horses. He knew the contours of their bodies, the sensitive spots, the subtle signs of discomfort or pleasure. But when he reached the stallion's left flank, the horse suddenly flinched, his muscles contracting in a spasm of pain. Hank froze, his eyes narrowed, his senses on high alert. He parted the horse's coat with his fingers, revealing a long, jagged scar running down the animal's side. The sight of it sent an unexpected jolt through his chest, a wave of nausea and dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him. It wasn't fresh, but it had been deep once, deep enough to leave a permanent mark, a lasting testament to some past trauma. Hank traced the scar with calloused fingers, feeling the roughness of the healed-over tissue. He had seen injuries like this before, battle scars from a life lived on the edge, but something about this one, the way it twisted and contorted, the way it seemed to pulse with a hidden pain, made his breath hitch. A memory stirred, faint at first, like a whisper in the back of his mind, then suddenly it hit him like a lightning strike, illuminating the darkness with a blinding flash of recognition. A younger Hank, full of life and vigor, gripping the reins of a powerful chestnut stallion, galloping through an open field, the wind whipping through his hair, the sun on his face, the rush of adrenaline, the sheer exhilaration of freedom, the unshakable bond between man and beast. And then, chaos. A broken fence, a splintering crack, the sickening sight of blood streaking against a golden coat, the desperate cries of an injured animal. The world had tilted on its axis, throwing him into a nightmare he couldn't escape from. Hank's grip tightened on the brush, his chest aching as the realization settled in, cold and heavy as a tombstone. This wasn't just any horse. This was his horse, the one he had lost years ago, the one he had believed was dead. Thunder, the stallion he had raised from a foal, his partner, his confidant, the horse that had been more than just an animal, but a part of his very soul. His knees felt weak, and for a moment the barn around him seemed to blur, the familiar sights and sounds fading into a distant echo. The weight of the past pressed down on him like a heavy stone, threatening to crush him under its unbearable weight. Slowly he stepped back, staring at the stallion as if seeing him for the first time. The horse met his gaze with a quiet intensity, his dark eyes filled with something Hank couldn't ignore. Recognition, understanding, almost as if he, too, was remembering, reliving the shared moments of their past. Hank swallowed hard, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. How was this possible? How could Thunder, the horse he had mourned, the horse he had buried in his heart all those years ago, be standing there, flesh and blood, staring back at him with such profound familiarity? The same deep brown eyes, the same proud stance, the same unwavering spirit, and now the undeniable proof, the scar, a map of their shared history etched onto the stallion's flank. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the stallion's door for support, his mind reeling from the shock of the revelation. The stallion took a slow step forward, his nostrils flaring as he exhaled a warm breath, a soft nicker rumbling in his chest. Hank barely noticed. His thoughts had already been pulled backwards, sucked into the vortex of memories he had spent years trying to forget. He could see it so clearly now, the accident, the desperate fight to save Thunder, the agonizing hours spent tending to his wounds, praying for a miracle, the night he had spent sitting in the dirt, cradling Thunder's head in his lap, convinced that his companion would never rise again. And then, the heartbreaking decision to let go, to end his suffering. The vet had told him there was nothing more to be done, that Thunder's injuries were too severe, that his chances of survival were slim to none. So Hank had walked away, leaving behind not just the horse he loved, but a piece of himself, a part of his soul that could never be recovered. And yet here he was, standing before him, alive and breathing. How? The question echoed in his mind, a persistent and insistent voice that demanded an answer. Hank swallowed hard, forcing himself to think rationally, to consider the possibility that he was mistaken. Maybe this was just another horse, one that looked like Thunder, moved like Thunder, possessed some of the same characteristics that had made Thunder so special. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him, twisting the past into the present, creating a false reality to ease the pain of his long-ago loss. He had heard of strange coincidences before, of uncanny resemblances that defied explanation, but deep down a part of him refused to believe in coincidences, not with this, not with Thunder. The connection he felt was too strong, too visceral, to be dismissed as mere chance. With a deep breath, Hank reached out again, this time pressing his palm against the stallion's forehead. The horse didn't pull away, didn't shy from his touch. Instead, he closed his eyes, leaning into the contact as if seeking comfort and reassurance. Hank felt his throat tighten, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. It was the same quiet trust, the same unspoken connection that had always existed between them. He had spent years trying to forget, trying to bury the memories of their shared past, but Thunder, his Thunder, had never forgotten him. His fingers curled slightly in the stallion's mane, his touch gentle and reverent. "Thunder," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a choked sob escaping his lips. He didn't expect an answer, but the weight of the question filled the barn like a storm cloud, heavy with unspoken grief and unanswered mysteries. How had this horse survived? Where had he been all these years, and why, after all he had endured, had no one wanted him at the auction? The stallion let out a deep, slow sigh, as if he too carried the weight of time, the burden of untold stories. Hank exhaled, feeling something inside him shift. A sense of resignation and acceptance mingled with a renewed determination to uncover the truth. Whatever had happened, whatever strange twist of fate had brought them back together, one thing was certain: this wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a long and arduous journey, a quest to unravel the mysteries of Thunder's past and to rediscover the bond that had once united them. Hank barely slept that night, his mind a whirlwind of memories, questions, and doubts. Every time he closed his eyes, images of Thunder flashed before him, vivid and intense, pulling him back into the past. The gallops through endless fields, the whispered commands, the quiet moments when he would sit beside Thunder after a long day just listening to the wind and sharing a silent communion. And then the accident, the blood, the final devastating moment when he had walked away, believing it was the only choice. But if he had been wrong, if Thunder was indeed alive, what had happened in the years between? What had he endured? Who had cared for him, and why had they ultimately abandoned him? The question swirled around in his mind, refusing to coalesce into any semblance of order. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the landscape, Hank had already made up his mind. He needed answers, and he wouldn't rest until he found them. He grabbed a thermos of coffee, shrugged on his worn-out jacket, and stepped outside, ready to face the day. The stallion was awake, standing near the stall door, ears pricked forward as if waiting for him. He watched Hank with an unwavering gaze, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Hank studied him for a long moment, taking in every detail, searching for any clue that might unlock the secrets of his past. Finally, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "Guess we got some digging to do, huh, boy?" The horse let out a soft huff, his warm breath visible in the cool morning air, as if acknowledging the challenge that lay ahead. Hank's first stop was the auction house, the place where their paths had inexplicably crossed once again. The building was mostly empty, the frenetic energy from the previous night's sales now reduced to a handful of workers cleaning up the remnants of another high-stakes event. The air was thick with the smell of sawdust and horse sweat, a lingering reminder of the drama that had unfolded within those walls. Hank found the auctioneer in his office, going through stacks of paperwork, his brow furrowed in concentration. The man looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. "Morning, Hank," he greeted with a nod, barely looking up. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." Hank leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the auctioneer. "That horse I bought last night," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "The chestnut stallion. Where'd he come from?" The auctioneer finally looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. He shuffled through a pile of documents before pulling out a file. "Came in from a ranch about 2 counties over," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Wasn't much interest in him, which was odd given his build. Thought he'd go for a good price, but—" He hesitated, his voice trailing off. "But what?" Hank pressed, his patience wearing thin. The auctioneer sighed, setting the file down on the desk. Owner didn't leave much info, just said the horse had been through a lot and wasn't suited for competition anymore. Didn't want him on the ranch, didn't care what happened to him. Honestly, Hank, it was like he just wanted to be rid of the poor thing. A strange chill ran down Hank's spine. Someone had owned Thunder, kept him all these years, but why would they just throw him away like he was nothing but a broken toy? And more importantly, why hadn't they mentioned where he came from before that? Why had they concealed his true identity? Hank gripped the file tightly, his callous fingers tracing over the edges of the worn paper. Something about this didn't sit right with him, a nagging feeling that he was being deliberately misled. A horse like Thunder, strong, well-built, clearly well-trained, should have been a prized possession, not a cast-off to be discarded without a second thought. And yet, someone had thrown him away, like he was worthless. Why? The thought burned in his mind as he flipped through the sparse details in the paperwork. No sire or dam information, no registration number, just a vague note. Retired. No longer fit for work. His gut told him there was more to this story, a hidden narrative that someone was desperately trying to conceal. He looked back at the auctioneer, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Who owned him before the ranch that sent him here, he asked, his voice demanding an answer. The man scratched his head, flipping through another set of records. Doesn't say, he replied, his voice apologetic. Just list the last ranch as the seller. Could have come from anywhere before that. Hank clenched his jaw, his frustration growing. He hated dead ends, but this wasn't over. He wouldn't let it be over. He would find the answers he sought, no matter how long it took, no matter what obstacles he had to overcome. Back at the ranch, the stallion stood quietly in the corral, his deep brown eyes following Hank's every move. There was something unsettling about the way he watched him, not with fear or distrust, but with a sense of knowing, almost as if he was waiting for Hank to put the pieces together, to unravel the mystery of their shared past. Hank exhaled, running a hand over his face, trying to clear his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that Thunder was trying to communicate with him, to guide him on this quest for the truth. He stepped closer to the corral, his voice soft and reassuring. All right, boy, he said. I don't know what you've been through, but we're going to find out together. On instinct, Hank reached for the halter and led the horse out of the corral. If Thunder was who he thought he was, maybe, just maybe, he'd remember something. Some detail from his past that could help them piece together the missing years. Hank saddled him up, his movements careful but firm, his touch gentle and respectful. The stallion didn't fight him, didn't resist. In fact, he stood still, as if the saddle was nothing new, as if he had worn it countless times before. When Hank placed his boot in the stirrup and swung himself up onto Thunder's back, the horse remained steady, his ears flicking back to listen to his commands. It was too natural, too easy. It was as if they had done this 1,000 times before, as if their bodies remembered a dance that their minds had forgotten. Hank hesitated for only a second before gripping the reins and giving a gentle squeeze with his legs. The stallion moved forward immediately, his gait smooth and powerful. The moment his hooves hit the open field, it was as if something clicked into place. A switch flipped in his brain. He wasn't just any horse, aimlessly wandering through a field. He was trained, experienced, and he was waiting for this, longing for the feel of the wind in his mane, the rhythm of the gallop, the connection with the man on his back. As they rode, Hank's mind raced, trying to make sense of the conflicting information he had gathered. If Thunder had been discarded, it wasn't because he was weak or untrained. It was because someone wanted him gone. Someone had erased his past and tried to bury him in anonymity. And the more Hank thought about it, the more he realized that whoever had done this never expected Thunder to find his way back to him, never anticipated the enduring power of their bond. The wind howled through the fields, whipping at Hank's face as he tightened his grip on the reins. Whatever the truth was, it was buried deep, but he was going to dig it up, no matter what it took, no matter what secrets it revealed. Hank's hands were steady on the reins, but his heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that echoed the urgency of his quest. The stallion moved beneath him with power and precision, responding to the slightest shift of his weight, the subtlest cue. This was no ordinary horse. Whoever had owned him before had trained him well, too well for someone to simply throw him away. The more they rode, the more the truth pressed against Hank's mind, demanding to be uncovered, urging him to confront the shadows of the past. After several minutes, Hank pulled the stallion to a stop near the old oak tree that stood at the edge of his ranch. a sentinel that had witnessed generations of triumphs and tragedies. The horse snorted, shaking his mane, but didn't resist. He seemed content, almost at peace, to be standing there side by side with Hank, under the watchful gaze of the ancient tree. Hank ran a hand over the stallion's neck, his fingers brushing against the rough scar that marked his flank. "What happened to you, boy?" he murmured, his voice filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "What did they do to you?" As if in response, the stallion nudged him gently with his head, his dark eyes filled with a silent plea. "Take me back," they seemed to say. "Help me remember." Hank knew what he had to do. He had to retrace Thunder's steps, to follow the trail of breadcrumbs that had led him back to the ranch. He had to find the people who had held him captive, the ones who had tried to erase his past, and he had to make them answer for what they had done. But he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, someone he could trust, someone who wouldn't judge him for his past mistakes, someone who would stand by him no matter what he discovered. He thought of Sarah, his daughter, the only family he had left. They had been estranged for years, their relationship strained by his choices, his failures, but he knew that deep down she still cared for him, and he believed that she was the only one who could help him now. He turned Thunder back toward the ranch, his mind made up. It was time to face his past, to confront his demons, and to ask for forgiveness. It was time to bring his family back together, to heal the wounds that had festered for too long. It was time to embark on a new chapter, a chapter filled with hope, redemption, and the enduring power of love.